Pocahontas as a character was brought up, she was constantly called an Indian princess. But why does my English class think that? Now, there is a very, very broad answer to this question, but we're going to look at the short answers as to save that for later. So the main criticisms they have of Pocahontas as an Indian princess is that she has an animal companion, is sexualized, has skimpy clothes, and is conventionally attractive. First, let's look at Pocahontas having animal companions. So she has a raccoon and a hummingbird, but what exactly does this mean? Because in my opinion, it's definitely not that she's an Indian princess. In my opinion, the reason she has animal companions is because Pocahontas is not an Indian princess. She is a Disney princess that is Indian. Very big difference there. Animal companions are a Disney princess trait. They have always been a Disney princess trait. To name a few examples, let's go through some Disney princesses who have animal companions. Snow White from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Cinderella from Cinderella, Aurora from Sleeping Beauty, Ariel from The Little Mermaid, Belle from Beauty and the Beast, Jasmine from Aladdin, Mulan from Mulan, Tiana from The Princess and the Frog, Rapunzel from Tangled, Merida from Brave, Moana from Moana. These 11 Disney princesses all have animal companions, and it is not because they are all Indian princesses. It is obviously because they are Disney princesses. The next point we're covering is Pocahontas being portrayed as very attractive or being sexualized. Specifically, with her tight waist and skimpy clothes, as is for the third point. Pocahontas being sexualized is nothing new to Disney princesses, to be real. Tiana from Princess and the Frog, Cinderella, basically any princess who's ever worn a dress has been sexualized at some point to the same degree of Pocahontas. Pocahontas' skimpy dress isn't because they looked at her and said, let's make a super sexual Indian princess stereotype character. They looked at Pocahontas' history as Mataoaka and took real incentive from the real Powhatan tribe and gave it to Pocahontas, this being the dress, which is what Pocahontas would have worn as a noble in Powhatan society. So criticizing Pocahontas for wearing a skimpy dress is actually criticizing the Powhatan tribe directly. Before we move on to a point not made by my English class, I'd like to tie all loose ends. Pocahontas is conventionally attractive because that's what our society likes the most. People don't like admitting it, but they are not attracted to watch a movie if the main character isn't very attractive. There are outliers like the Hunchback of Notre Dame, but throughout our society, it's very, very clear that this is the status quo. Indigo music specifically states that a part of Pocahontas' Indian princess narrative is a strong connection to nature and a deep spiritual life embodied by her relationship with the talking tree Grandmother Willow. Let's look at some Disney princesses who talk to supernatural beings similar to Grandmother Willow. Cinderella talks to her fairy godmother. Aurora talks to the three good fairies. Belle talks to the enchanted castle inhabitants. Mulan talks to a dragon guardian. Merida talks to the willow, the wisps, and the witch. And Moana talks to Maui, a demigod, and Te Fiti and Takar, who are both gods. It's important to point out that Grandmother Willow is the only talking tree in the list. But that is important because it points out the fact that these supernatural beings are based on culture, not tropes or stereotypes. Mulan and the guardian dragon is obviously an extension of Chinese culture. Moana and Te Fiti and Takar are obviously an extension of Polynesian culture. Pocahontas and Grandmother Willow are obviously an extension of Indigenous Powhatan culture. Now, let's take a step back and look at why and how inattention blindness is affecting movies like Pocahontas and Dances with Wolves. On the why aspect, there are many reasons why inattention blindness is coming up, and I think mainly it's society switching from right to left on the political spectrum. People are becoming more accepting of diverse communities such as Black communities, Indigenous communities, and LGBTQ communities. As well as this, they're criticizing media a lot more harshly for bad representation. This shift from right to left in Western society changes a lot in our media and our education. Specifically, in Canada, there is a grade 11 course specifically dedicated to learning about Indigenous tropes. In the US, tons of BLM movements for fat acceptance, and movements for LGBTQ are coming up all over the place. Those are all good things, but with the good, you commonly have to take at least some bad. The bad being the overanalyzing and overcriticism of movies like Pocahontas and Dances with Wolves. The constant criticism of Westerns, which is constantly being thrown in your face over and over and over again, even in our school systems. You get to a point where basically anything made by a white person about anyone of color is immediately criticized simply because of that. People criticizing media that has bad representation is overall a great idea, but when it becomes an issue is when too many people are doing it at the same time. In our society, we're constantly being flooded with, this is racist, and this is stereotypical, and this is a trope, and that is a trope, and we're not focusing on the good representation anymore. Taking away focus from good representation and entirely focusing on bad representation brings us back to the point of inattention blindness. We're all being told to focus on bad representation, so we miss the good representation. Let's take Dances with Wolves and Pocahontas for example. Both movies have been said to have inaccurate portrayals of Indigenous people, which, through research, is obviously been disproven. The Indigenous people in Pocahontas were dumbed down because it is a children's movie, and the Indigenous people for Dances with Wolves were said to be very good representations of Indigenous people by the tribe they were representing. As well as that, both movies have good integral themes about colonization, the Westerns, and Indigenous people. Pocahontas' being that Indigenous people and colonizers can get along, and that they're not so different as they seem. Dances with Wolves being that Indigenous peoples and their culture is equivalent to, or in some cases, better than white culture is. The reason people say Pocahontas and Dances with Wolves have bad representation of Indigenous people is because they see other media saying Indigenous people are badly represented in media. And then they attribute that to Pocahontas and Dances with Wolves. So what does this do to the representation of Indigenous peoples in these movies? In Pocahontas, it turns the Powhatan tribe from sustainable, respectable, and civilized people into savage, peaceful, cultureless buffoons who get walked on by white people in every single instance of history. And in the case of Indigenous people in Dances with Wolves, it turns them from helpful, prideful, and civilized people into savage, uncivilized weaklings just waiting for John's white hand to wash over them and correct their society. This is an extreme misrepresentation of what is happening in the media and is an awful look for Indigenous people as a whole. The idea I'm trying to get at by showing you these two examples is that people are taking the good representation in these movies and transforming it into bad representation because they've been trained to only see the bad. They have that inattentional blindness where they only see the bad, and it's seriously hurting Indigenous representation. If you turn every good representation into bad representation, where do you get your good representation from? They don't get good representation if you take it all away. To add on to the idea that good representation is being taken away from Indigenous people, we should look at the reduced willingness to participate in creating such media. What I mean by that? People don't want to make something that they know they will lose money on or get heavily criticized for. Why would someone like Christopher Nolan make a movie about Indigenous people if he thinks his reputation will be tarnished by it? All media depicting Indigenous people being heavily criticized or picked apart by society encourages a paralysis in storytelling, where nobody tells any stories about Indigenous people at all. The reason why this is an issue is because it stops people from even trying. So how do you get to your perfect representation of Indigenous people without the attempts? How do you get to the good with none of the bad? It just doesn't happen. Inattentional blindness has forced people to have only bad representation or think they only have bad representation. This puts you in a chokehold where you're forced to choose bad representation or not existing in media. These are both awful decisions. Now, finally, let's tie it all together and come to a conclusion. Overanalyzing Indigenous tropes within media is harmful to the representation of Indigenous peoples. This is because it takes the focus away from good representation, such as Pocahontas, and puts emphasis on the bad representation, such as Bugs Bunny. It also reduces the willingness to engage in making such content. People like Christopher Nolan and Quentin Tarantino will never make an Indigenous movie because the critics will always criticize them. they are afraid of losing their reputation because they will be criticized so heavily. This causes a paralysis in storytelling, which leaves Indigenous people in a lose-lose situation. When this extreme criticism happens and people stop making stories, it puts Indigenous people in a bubble of either not existing in media or being offensive in media. And neither of the two outcomes result in good representation for Indigenous people overall. So how do we fix this problem? Immediately, I think we need to go to the root or the base of the issue with inattention blindness. To stop inattention blindness, we should make learning about Indigenous peoples optional instead of forcing it on people. As well as that, we should try to cut down on criticizing Indigenous people in movies, in media. This overall would put less strain on the Indigenous representation and the filmmakers' representation of Indigenous people. It could possibly result in many more Indigenous films being made without being criticized for being slightly inaccurate or having some bad misrepresentation. Thank you for watching.